I spent 24 years preserving other people's stories while my own was systematically erased. I cataloged 17,852 historical documents. I restored 3,674 family photographs. I developed preservation techniques that saved my institution $245,000. I maintained 3,650 pages of documentation for my neurodivergent son's educational journey. I spent 2,100 hours managing my mother's end-of-life care, all while my own contributions faded like improperly preserved film, relegated to basement storage, where no one would see them until they disintegrated entirely. The Westbrook County Heritage Celebration buzzed around me, the grand hall adorned with artifacts I had spent months preparing. My hands throbbed as I smoothed the protective covering over the town's founding charter. Lightning spikes of pain shot through my arthritic joints as I completed the precise work no one else was trained to do. "Linda, we need more programs at the refreshment table," called Zoe, our 28-year-old digital archivist, without looking up from her tablet. "I'll bring them right over," I replied, my voice automatically shrinking to that accommodating tone I had perfected over decades. The same tone I used when my ex-husband Andrew made demands about our son Kevin's care. The same tone I used when my boss forgot, again, that I had developed the preservation system the entire center relied upon. I was arranging the programs, which I had designed, researched, and produced myself, when Director Harlow took the podium. James Harlow had been with the center just 5 years, hired after I trained him when he joined as an administrative assistant. His rise to director had been fueled by charisma rather than expertise. "Welcome to our annual Heritage Celebration," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority that somehow always eluded mine. "Tonight, we're excited to announce our new Community Heritage Preservation Initiative." My head snapped up. This was the first I had heard of any new initiative. Thanks to a generous grant of $325,000, we'll be launching an innovative methodology for preserving community records and family histories. Harlow continued, his smile broadening as appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd. My stomach clenched into a cold, hard knot. Preservation methodology? That sounded remarkably like the system I had developed over the past 7 years. The one I had documented meticulously, the one I had presented to Harlow just last month as a potential grant opportunity. This departmental innovation will revolutionize how we approach community-based historical preservation, Harlow was saying, clicking through slides that looked eerily familiar. By integrating traditional archival techniques with oral history validation. The room tilted sideways. Those were my words, my techniques, my slides. Even that phrase had come directly from my proposal, word for word. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead and down my spine. My skin prickled as if thousands of invisible needles were piercing my flesh all at once. The program papers trembled in my hands, betraying my carefully maintained composure. Something fierce and unfamiliar uncurled in my chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but a molten combination that made it suddenly impossible to breathe. Eleanor Washington, a community elder whose family history I had helped preserve after the flood damaged their ancestral home, caught my eye from across the room. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she glanced between me and Harlow, clearly recognizing the discrepancy. She knew whose techniques these were. She had watched me develop them in her living room as I salvaged her grandmother's irreplaceable letters. "We'll be launching this initiative next month," Harlow continued, under the direction of our digital archives team led by Zoe Chen. Zoe straightened, a self-satisfied smile playing at her lips. She had been at the center for exactly 6 months. "Linda Matthews will be transitioning to our General Archives department," Harlow added, almost as an afterthought, "where her traditional expertise will continue to be an asset." Traditional expertise. as if my methods were outdated relics rather than the innovative techniques he was currently claiming as departmental achievements. As if I were an artifact being cataloged and stored away myself. The room grew suffocatingly hot, my cardigan suddenly crushing against my skin. I set down the programs and stepped back toward the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I felt it might crack bone. A physical drumbeat of protest I couldn't voice aloud. Diane Sullivan, my former colleague now at the State Historical Society, touched my elbow. "Linda, isn't that your preservation methodology?" she whispered, her face clouded with concern. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "That's blatant appropriation," she continued, indignation coloring her tone. "You need to say something, right now." But what could I say? In 24 years, I had never confronted anyone directly. I had built my career on being accommodating, on stepping aside, on doing excellent work quietly, without demanding recognition. Just as I had built my marriage on supporting Andrew's career while downplaying my own, just as I had structured my life around others' needs, while minimizing my own until I had nearly disappeared. As I stood frozen, my phone vibrated. A text from my son Kevin's support coordinator. "Need to discuss changes to Kevin's program. Andrew has requested reduction in services, claiming your undemanding job means you can provide more support hours yourself." The two betrayals, professional and personal, collided in a single moment. The weight pressed against my chest until I could scarcely breathe. 24 years of meticulous documentation at work, erased in a single presentation. 22 years of specialized educational support for my son, dismissed as something that could be casually increased to accommodate my ex-husband's financial preferences. I slipped out a side door into the cool evening air. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them against the rough brick wall to steady them. The texture grounded me momentarily. The coarse surface against my fingertips was a sharp contrast to the smooth archival gloves I usually wore. How many times had I carefully preserved other people's histories while my own contributions faded into the background? How many times had I ensured proper attribution for historical artifacts while accepting the erasure of my own work? How many times had I documented other families' legacies while my own expertise was dismissed as traditional and undemanding? Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Zoe nodding along enthusiastically, already planning how she would lead the project, built on my methodology. My phone vibrated again. A message from Andrew. "Meeting with Kevin's support coordinator tomorrow at 10. You need to be there. This is non-negotiable." Non-negotiable. How typical of Andrew to phrase a demand as if my time, my expertise, my very life were simply resources to be allocated according to his preferences. Just as Harlow viewed my methodological innovations as departmental assets to be claimed without attribution, I straightened my shoulders, feeling something shift inside me. A tectonic rearrangement of some long-dormant part of myself. For 24 years, I had carefully documented everything: research findings, methodological developments, historical connections. My notebooks filled a shelf in my home office, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. My digital archives, all time-stamped and backed up, provided an undeniable record of my contribution. I had been treating my own life as if it were an archive in deep storage, carefully preserved but inaccessible, protected but unseen. But archives were meant to be accessed. Records were meant to be retrieved. What if I applied my professional standards to my personal situation? What if I treated the erasure of my contributions not as an inevitable disappointment, but as an error in the historical record that needed correction? I took a deep breath, the evening air filling my lungs with the scent of autumn leaves and possibility. Inside, Harlow was concluding his presentation to enthusiastic applause. Tomorrow, he would submit the grant documentation claiming my methodology as departmental innovation. Tomorrow, Andrew would attempt to restructure Kevin's support services, based on a dismissive assessment of my professional responsibilities. But tomorrow, I would begin retrieving the records. Tomorrow, I would start the process of proper attribution. As I turned to re-enter the building, my phone vibrated with an email notification from the county court. Notice of legal action, Matthews property dispute. I opened the email, and my world tilted again. Andrew had filed for reduction of financial support for Kevin, citing my failure to maximize career potential as evidence that I should compensate by providing more direct care hours. Attached was a sworn statement claiming my job was primarily administrative and undemanding. 24 years of specialized expertise reduced to a convenient dismissal, just like my preservation methodology had been reduced to departmental innovation. I glanced back through the window at the celebration continuing without me, at my work being applauded under someone else's name. Something inside me, something I had buried so deep I had forgotten it was there, finally broke free. I drove home, in a daze, the Evergreen Development representative's words echoing, "Perhaps you should speak with a lawyer." The implications were unmistakable: forgery, fraud, a legal mess growing more damaging by the day. My small house stood silent, evening light casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. I had refinished after the divorce. It wasn't much, a modest ranch with a converted garage office, but it was mine. The only thing Andrew hadn't contested, probably because he considered it beneath him. I moved to the antique roll-top desk in my living room corner, my grandmother's desk, the one piece of family history I had kept when everything else was divided after my marriage ended. My fingers traced the worn oak surface, feeling indentations from decades of use. The wood felt warm against my skin, as if it held the memories of every woman who had worked there. My grandmother had been county clerk for 40 years, maintaining records few appreciated, but everyone relied upon. Like her, I had built my life preserving what others took for granted. Like her, I had watched my contributions fade into the background, invisible until they failed. I unrolled the top, revealing dozens of meticulously organized compartments. From the central drawer, I withdrew a thick manila folder labeled Professional Documentation, copies of every performance review, project report, and methodology I had developed over 24 years. The first page was my job description from 1999. Fresh from graduate school with a master's in archival science, I had been eager to apply cutting-edge preservation techniques to our county's historical records. I could have gone anywhere, I murmured, throat tightening. The Smithsonian had expressed interest. The National Archives had invited me for a second interview, but I had chosen Westbrook because Andrew's law practice was here, because staying meant stability for Kevin, because family came first, always. I found my first major innovation, a technique for water-damaged documents that saved pioneer diaries after the flood of 2004. My supervisor's note read, "Excellent work, Linda. This technique should be documented for future reference." And it had been by me, meticulously. The same technique now part of Harlow's departmental innovation. I continued through report after report. In 2010, a system for integrating digital archives with physical preservation adopted by 3 neighboring counties. In 2015, a methodology for authenticating oral histories that expanded our collection's diversity. And recently, my comprehensive approach to family historical documentation, the very methodology Harlow was now claiming. Each innovation was thoroughly documented, dated, and signed. Each acknowledged with praise, but never with the professional advancement they deserved. Because alongside each achievement was a personal circumstance that had kept me from pushing forward. Kevin's autism diagnosis requiring specialized advocacy. My mother's declining health, Andrew's career demands always taking precedence over mine. I closed that folder and opened another. Financial contributions, marriage, Inside was a meticulous accounting of 27 years, $187,500 toward our family home, my entire inheritance, $42,850 for Kevin's specialized educational supports, $37,500 for my mother's care beyond Medicare, $112,000 during periods when Andrew's law practice struggled. I had tracked it all because documentation was second nature. Not that it mattered in the divorce. Andrew's attorney successfully argued my contributions were marital assets, while his law practice remained primarily his separate property. A knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly closed the desk before answering. Sarah stood on my porch, wine bottle in hand. Thought you might need a friend after that disaster of a presentation. For 15 years, Sarah had been my confidant. While our mutual friends gravitated toward Andrew's orbit after the divorce, Sarah remained steadfast. You heard about that? I asked, the knot in my chest loosening slightly. Diane called me, said Harlow stole your methodology and is claiming it as his own, and then reassigned me to General Archives while putting Zoe in charge of implementing my techniques. Sarah's eyebrows shot up as she poured wine. Zoe? She's been there, 6 months? But she's young, photogenic, and comfortable with self-promotion, everything Harlow values. I sipped the wine, feeling it burn down my throat, a welcome counterpoint to the cold fury building in my chest. Unlike those of us who actually do the work, Sarah said, raising her glass. To the invisible infrastructure that keeps the world running while others take the credit. The phrase struck me powerfully. That's exactly what I had been professionally and personally. The systems I built, the foundations I established, all essential but unseen, acknowledged only when they failed. When I told Sarah about Andrew forging my signature and the legal notice concerning Kevin's support, her expression darkened. Linda, that's criminal. Forgery, fraud, these aren't small issues. But fighting Andrew legally has never ended well for me. He has resources, connections, credibility I've never matched. Because you've never fought on your own terms, Sarah leaned forward intensely. You've always tried to be reasonable, to compromise, to avoid conflict. Her observation stung with its accuracy. How many times had I swallowed objections to maintain peace? How many times had I documented injustice without correcting it? Remember when we first met? Sarah asked. You brought over that incredible historical documentation of our house, architectural plans, photographs, stories from longtime residents. I smiled faintly. Historical research had always been my gift, offered freely, often without recognition. What I remember most was Andrew's reaction. He said you were bothering us with your little research projects, and we were just being polite. Then he started telling David about property values, completely dismissing your incredible work. Sarah's eyes held mine. I saw the pattern even before you did. I looked away uncomfortably. Sarah had recognized the dynamics of my marriage long before I had. You haven't fully left that pattern behind, she said carefully. You're still operating as if your contributions don't matter, as if your work is just a little project rather than valuable intellectual property. Her words hit with the force of truth. Even after the divorce, I was functioning within Andrew's framework, where my work was secondary, my expertise dismissible, my time eternally flexible for others' needs. The same framework Harlow was exploiting professionally. Let me show you something, I said, leading her to my home office. The space was meticulously organized with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and 37 identical black leather journals, each labeled by year, containing detailed notes on every project and innovation I had developed. I opened one to pages describing my community preservation methodology, dated September 12, 2016, with detailed sketches of process flow, materials, and outcomes. I've documented everything, I said, fingers tracing the neat handwriting. Even emails where Harlow asked questions, clearly showing he didn't understand it. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to amazement. "Linda, this is publishable material." "I know." I pulled out another journal containing techniques for integrating oral histories with document authentication. "I've always approached my work as creating a permanent record. That's what archivists do. We preserve what matters." "Except you never published," Sarah observed. "You never presented at conferences. You never claimed proper credit." I nodded, feeling regret settle between my shoulder blades. There was always a reason to wait. Kevin needed me. Mom's health was declining. Andrew thought it would be showing off. My phone rang, an unknown number. "Ms. Matthews?" "This is Eleanor Washington." Eleanor was a respected elder whose family had been in Westbrook for 6 generations. I had preserved her family's historical documents after the flood damaged their ancestral home. "That presentation tonight, those were your methodologies," Mr. Harlow was describing, weren't they? "The same techniques you used with my family's letters." A lump formed in my throat. "Yes, they." "I thought so. I remember watching you develop those approaches in my living room. How you integrated our family stories with the documents, created that authentication system that preserved both letters and context." "Thank you for remembering," I said softly. "It's not right," Eleanor continued firmly. "Taking credit for another person's work is not right, especially when that work benefited our community." "What can I do?" she asked directly. "I'm still processing what happened. When you decide, let me know. My family owes you a debt for preserving our history, and I believe in giving credit where credit is due." After we hung up, Sarah smiled. "Sounds like you have an ally. One retired school teacher against the Historical Center's director and board," I said, but Eleanor's recognition had kindled something warm in my chest. A small flame of validation against the day's betrayals. My email notification chimed. From Diane. Documentation request. The State Historical Society message read, "Following our conversation about methodology appropriation, I'd like to formally request information about your community preservation techniques for potential implementation at the state level. With proper attribution, of course." "Proper attribution," I murmured. The words both validation and indictment. "The State Historical Society is interested in your methodology." "That's significant leverage," Sarah observed. I nodded, pieces aligning like a complex cataloging system, finally achieving order. "There's more," I said, showing Sarah a business card from my planner. "Thomas Barrett, Pharmaceutical Research Director, Novara Pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical company." "What does that have to do with archives?" "Not archives." "Kevin," my body suddenly felt heavy with exhaustion. "I've maintained detailed records of every intervention and educational approach I've developed for Kevin over 22 years. The school district has requested my specialized documentation system for implementation with other students." I showed her another card from the special education director. "They've offered me a consulting fee. Apparently, my approach to integrating educational, medical, and developmental documentation is innovative." Sarah's eyes widened. "So your expertise has value in multiple domains." Domains Andrew dismissed as me just being a mom or just keeping old papers. I confirmed, voice hardening. "The same expertise he's minimizing as an undemanding job to reduce his financial support and increase my caregiving hours." The parallel was unmistakable. Professional expertise, devalued by Harlow. Parental expertise, devalued by Andrew. Both benefiting from my skills while dismissing their significance. Both extracting maximum value while providing minimum recognition. "The pattern is identical," I said, the realization sending a physical shock wave through my body. Work and home. Harlow and Andrew. Different contexts, same dynamic. "Are you ready to break the pattern in both domains?" Sarah asked. I looked at my grandmother's desk, containing generations of women's work. at my meticulously documented contributions, at business cards from people who recognized the value I'd been trained to minimize. "I'm a professional archivist," I said, my voice finding firm resonance. "My career has been dedicated to ensuring valuable things aren't lost, that important contributions are properly preserved, cataloged, and attributed." I picked up my grandmother's journal, leather cover worn smooth from decades of use. Inside were her notes on the county's first standardized record-keeping system, developed by her but implemented under the county manager's name in 1962. It's time to apply those professional standards to my own life. What I didn't say was that I had already begun gathering evidence, copies of Harlow's emails asking questions about my methodology, recordings of meetings where I had presented the techniques, digital files with timestamps establishing the timeline of development. I hadn't done this out of prescience. I had done it because that's what archivists do. We preserve, we document, we create unassailable records. I never expected the most important archive I'd build would be the one documenting my own erasure. The next morning dawned with unnerving clarity. I dressed with unusual care, choosing a structured navy blazer instead of my usual cardigan, adding a small pendant in the shape of an antique key that had been my grandmother's. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened the necklace, but not from fear. A strange electric current pulsed through my body, something between determination and awakening. I studied my reflection, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Same face, same features, but something fundamental had shifted in my eyes. I had 2 appointments scheduled, first with the lawyer Sarah had recommended, Jessica Torres, and later with Evergreen Development. Between them, I had a shift at the historical center, my first since Harlow's presentation. My hands moved steadily as I prepared, belaying the anxiety churning beneath. The arthritis that had been flaring more frequently seemed temporarily quieted, as if my body understood the need for precision today. I packed my documentation carefully, selected journals, financial records, emails, and performance reviews, each in acid-free folders, each meticulously labeled. Jessica Torres's office was in a converted Victorian downtown. Her practice focused on intellectual property and employment law. She greeted me with a firm handshake and direct eye contact, a refreshing change from the dismissive glances I had grown accustomed to receiving. For 40 minutes, I laid out the parallel challenges: Harlow's appropriation of my methodology, Andrew's manipulation of my caregiving responsibilities, the forged signatures on land sales. Jessica listened without interruption, maintaining steady eye contact. When I finished, she leaned forward. "You have 3 separate legal issues here," she said, her voice carrying a clarity that cut through my confusion, "but they share a common thread. People in positions of power exploiting your work while minimizing your contributions." Her assessment was both validating and disquieting, the pattern so obvious to an outside observer, yet one I had normalized for decades. "The good news is that your documentation appears exceptionally thorough. The methodological appropriation might be actionable under intellectual property statutes. The forgery is clearly criminal. The support modification would require family court, but your documentation of specialized services should be persuasive." She outlined a multi-pronged approach: secure my documentation, gather witness statements, prepare formal communications, asserting my rights. By the end of our meeting, I had engaged her services, the first time I had ever sought legal representation, independent of a crisis. The historical center was unusually quiet when I arrived. I made my way to the basement archives where my desk had been relocated, a literal demotion from my previous main floor office. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Valuable historical documents were stored in the basement, accessible only when needed, otherwise hidden from view, just like my contributions. I logged in and began cataloging recent acquisitions with the same care I had always shown despite my simmering awareness of injustice. Around noon, I needed to retrieve an archival box from deep storage. As I navigated the narrow aisles of metal shelving, voices drifted down from the ventilation system connected to the conference room above. The grant documentation is due by Friday, Harlow was saying. Zoe, I need you to prepare the methodology section based on the framework I provided. I'm still trying to understand some of these processes, Zoe replied, frustration evident. The community authentication protocol is particularly complex. I'm not sure how it's supposed to work without Linda's direct involvement. My hands froze on the box I was retrieving. A cold thrill ran through me, not just at hearing my name, but at the explicit acknowledgement of my essential role. We don't need Linda, Harlow dismissed. The documentation is clear enough, and we can adapt as needed. Besides, it's a departmental methodology. She was just one contributor. The casual erasure in his tone sent a spike of heat through my chest. I pressed my palm against the cool metal shelving, forcing my breathing to remain steady. But everyone in the community associates these techniques with her, Zoe persisted. The Henderson family specifically asked if she would be handling their collection. That's precisely the problem. We can't have institutional methodologies dependent on individual personalities. Linda has been a dedicated archivist, but her approach is too personalized. Modern archival science is about scalable, replicable systems. I stood frozen, an archival box half pulled from its shelf, as Harlow continued dismantling my professional legacy. This wasn't just about claiming credit. It was about fundamentally misrepresenting the nature of my work. Besides, Harlow added, lowering his voice, between us, she's been distracted lately. Family issues, I gather. Her ex-husband mentioned something about increased caregiving responsibilities for their son. It's probably for the best that we're transitioning her to a less demanding role. The shock of hearing Andrew's interference, extending into my workplace, sent a jolt through my system so powerful I nearly dropped the box. The two domains of my life weren't just experiencing parallel patterns of erasure, they were actively colluding. My heart hammered against my ribs as the full implications crystallized. Andrew wasn't just diminishing me at home, he was actively undermining me at work. Harlow wasn't just appropriating my methodology, he was using my personal circumstances to justify professional erasure. With trembling hands, I carefully returned the box to its shelf, moving silently back to my desk. Rather than collapsing under this revelation, I felt a strange calm descend. The clarity that comes when a complex pattern finally becomes unmistakable. The pieces aligned with an almost audible click. The forgery of property documents, the diminishment of my professional contributions, the manipulation of my caregiving responsibilities. These weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated attempts to extract maximum value while providing minimum recognition. At my computer, I found an email from the special education director requesting a meeting about implementing my documentation system district-wide. Attached was a preliminary proposal outlining a $12,000 consulting contract that would position my methodology as a pilot program for potential statewide adoption. I stared at the figure, $12,000 for the same expertise Andrew dismissed as just being a mom, and Harlow relegated to traditional approaches. For skills I had developed through necessity, through thousands of hours of advocating for Kevin while maintaining my professional responsibilities. Almost without conscious thought, I forwarded the email to Jessica Torres with a brief note. Evidence of professional valuation of my parental expertise, relevant to both cases. My next appointment at Evergreen Development loomed ahead. I gathered my things, including the legal folder Jessica had prepared, and quietly left the historical center. No one noticed my departure. Invisible infrastructure remains invisible until it isn't there. The Evergreen Development offices occupied the top floor of our town's only high-rise, all-glass and polished surfaces. Tom Whitaker, the representative who had called me, met me in reception. "Ms. Matthews, thank you for coming in," he said. leading me to a conference room with a view of the town square. "I appreciate your willingness to address this situation directly." The hesitation before situation sent a ripple of awareness through me. He was uncomfortable. A good sign. He placed several documents on the table: land transfer agreements, development permits, environmental assessments. Each bore a signature purporting to be mine. I studied the forgeries with an archivist's trained eye. The pressure patterns were all wrong. Andrew always pressed too hard when forging my signature, creating deeper indentations than my naturally lighter hand. Our legal team flagged these inconsistencies during a routine review, Tom explained carefully. "The signatures don't match your verified signature from the property tax records." "Because I didn't sign them," I confirmed, my voice steady. "My ex-husband has been selling parcels of land that belong solely to me without my knowledge or consent." My directness visibly startled him. He shifted in his leather chair. "That's a serious allegation." "It's not an allegation, it's a documented fact." I opened my folder and removed the original deed showing my ownership, along with the relevant sections of the divorce decree. "The land has been in my family for 3 generations. It was explicitly excluded from our marital property in the divorce settlement." The paper felt crisp between my fingers as I slid it across the polished table. This was what I did best, presenting incontrovertible documentation. He reviewed the documents, his expression growing concerned. "This complicates things. We've already begun preliminary work based on these agreements." "I understand that's inconvenient, but it doesn't change the fact that these sales were conducted fraudulently. Ms. Matthews, Evergreen has already invested considerable resources based on forged documents," I interjected, surprising myself with my firmness. "Which is why I've had my attorney prepare this cease and desist letter." I placed Jessica's carefully worded document on the table. "All development activities on my property must stop immediately pending resolution of this matter." Tom's professional demeanor faltered. Sweat appeared on his forehead. "This is unusual. Mr. Matthews assured us everything was in order. He's a respected attorney in the community." "Yes, he relies heavily on that reputation," I acknowledged, gathering my documents. "But reputations should be based on actions, not appearances. And his actions include forging my signature on legal documents, a criminal offense." As I stood to leave, Tom asked, "What do you intend to do with the property?" "It's primarily wetlands, of limited development value, without significant investment." The question struck me as parallel to the dismissal of my botanical knowledge. "What were you doing with it anyway?" "It's just sitting there growing weeds." The same assumption that if something wasn't being monetized according to conventional standards, it had no value. "I intend," I said carefully, "to preserve it appropriately, just as I've been doing for decades." The weight of those words settled between us, carrying layers of meaning that extended far beyond the property itself. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of purpose. I reviewed all bank accounts, finding several transfers I hadn't authorized. I obtained copies of every document, supposedly bearing my signature. I scheduled the meeting about my documentation system implementation with the school district. By the time I arrived home, my car was filled with evidence, physical proof of systematic erasure across every domain of my life. I moved to my grandmother's desk and carefully unrolled the top. From the central drawer, I removed her journal, opening it to an entry from April. Today, my card catalog system was implemented countywide. William took full credit in the commission meeting, of course. Said it was a departmental development, though he's never cataloged a single book himself. The women in the records office know the truth. Sometimes I think that's enough, that the work itself matters more than who gets credit. Other days, I wonder what might have been possible if my name had been attached to my own innovations. If the pattern will be different for my granddaughter. My fingers trembled as they traced her handwriting, so similar to my own. The pattern, the same one I had perpetuated despite her hope for change. The same one threatening to extend to another generation through my son, who was learning that his father's contributions were valued while his mother's were dismissed. My phone chimed with a text from Diane. State Historical Society is very interested in your methodology. Director wants to meet next week. Almost simultaneously, an email arrived from Thomas Barrett at Novara Pharmaceuticals, following up on our conversation about specialized documentation systems for neurodivergent educational support. Our adaptive education division would like to explore implementation possibilities. I set the phone down, my skin tingling with awareness as connections formed between previously separate domains of my life. The community preservation methodology Harlow was claiming, the educational documentation system the school district wanted, the specialized techniques for family history authentication. They weren't separate innovations. They were variations of the same fundamental approach, one I had developed across multiple domains because I lived and worked across those domains. Because my expertise wasn't compartmentalized the way my life had been forced to be. I created a new folder on my laptop titled Integrated Methodology Documentation. Inside, I began organizing evidence from every aspect of my life: professional reports, educational advocacy materials, community preservation techniques, all revealing the same distinctive approach, the same methodological fingerprint across contexts. As the pattern emerged with unmistakable clarity, I felt something shift within me. My shoulders, habitually curved inward to minimize my presence, straightened perceptibly. My breathing deepened. The tension headache that had become my constant companion receded, replaced by a clarifying energy that radiated from my core outward. For the first time in decades, I saw my fragmented life as a unified whole, not divided into professional and personal domains, not compartmentalized into separate roles, but integrated through a consistent core of expertise that had value precisely because it transcended those artificial boundaries. I was not just an archivist who happened to be a mother, or a mother who happened to work in archives. I was a person whose unique contribution lay in the integration of those identities, in the methodology I had developed precisely because I navigated multiple worlds simultaneously. The revelation wasn't just professionally significant, it was personally transformative. The very fragmentation that had been used to diminish me, just a mom, just an archivist, traditional expertise, actually constituted my most innovative contribution. My chest expanded with a deep breath that seemed to fill spaces long collapsed by accommodation. Heat spread through my limbs, not the flush of embarrassment or the burn of anger, but the warmth of power long dormant, now awakening. I closed my grandmother's journal, running my fingers over its worn leather cover. She had preserved her truth even when others erased it from official records. She had documented her innovations even when others claimed them as their own. "That pattern stops with me," I whispered, the words vibrating in my chest with physical certainty. I reached for my phone and composed 3 messages to Jessica Torres. "I've gathered comprehensive documentation across all domains, ready to proceed on all fronts. To Diane Sullivan, would like to discuss State Historical Society meeting. My methodology spans multiple applications beyond traditional archives. To Eleanor Washington, thank you for your support. I've made a decision about how to proceed. Could we meet tomorrow to discuss?" As I sent the messages, a plan began taking shape, not just to reclaim credit for my innovations, but to establish a new framework that integrated rather than fragmented my expertise, that valued rather than dismissed the unique perspective I had developed by bridging domains others kept separate. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Challenging Harlow meant risking my job. Confronting Andrew meant facing the legal resources he wielded so effectively. Standing up to both meant dismantling patterns that had defined my entire adult life, but I understood that I wasn't just fighting for recognition. I was fighting for integration, for the right to be whole rather than fragmented, valued rather than diminished, visible rather than archived away. I was fighting to correct the historical record, and nobody understood that imperative better than an archivist. The next morning, I studied my reflection critically. Years of fading into institutional backgrounds reflected in my practical haircut, neutral wardrobe, and softened voice. "No more," I said aloud. The words reverberated against the bathroom tiles, sending a shiver down my spine. I dressed with deliberate care, selecting a deep burgundy blouse I'd rarely worn, too bold, too demanding of attention. The fabric felt rich against my skin, a tactile reminder of the value I was reclaiming. Eleanor Washington welcomed me into her Victorian home, her keen eyes immediately noticing the change. "Well now, something's different today." "Everything's different today," I replied, surprised by the conviction in my voice. Her sitting room showcased the family archives I'd helped preserve after the flood. The glass cases gleamed in morning light, protecting photographs and letters that might otherwise have been lost. "I've spoken with several families whose histories you've preserved," Eleanor said, setting down her teacup with a decisive click. "We're prepared to provide formal statements regarding your role in developing these techniques, dates, details, evolution of methodology, everything." My heart quickened. Eleanor was offering provenance validation through multiple independent sources, the gold standard of authentication. She handed me a folder from the side table. "The Historical Society Board has 3 community-appointed positions. The next appointment is in 3 months. I believe you should consider it." I stared at the highlighted bylaws, understanding slowly dawning. Eleanor wasn't just offering witness statements. She was suggesting a structural solution. "They'll resist," I said, fingertips tingling where they touched the paper. "Of course they will." Her smile held decades of experience. "That's precisely why it's necessary." At the school district offices, Special Education Director Patricia Gonzalez greeted me as a professional equal, without the dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to at the historical center. "Your documentation approach is exactly what we've been looking for," she said, fingers tracing my flowcharts with genuine interest. "Especially the integration of qualitative observations with quantitative metrics. It evolved through necessity," I explained, hearing new confidence in my voice. "Standard forms never captured the complexity of my son's experience." Patricia pushed a contract across her desk. $12,000 for initial consultation and system implementation, with potential for ongoing advisory. The figure represented more than money external validation of expertise that had been systematically dismissed. Expertise developed not despite being a mother, but because of it. My hands felt warm as I signed, another piece of my fragmented identity clicking into place. Jessica Torres reviewed my comprehensive documentation with growing interest: community witness statements, school district contract, evergreen development evidence, and chronology of my methodological development across domains. "This is exceptional documentation, Linda, far beyond what most clients provide." "I'm an archivist," I said simply. "Documentation is what I do." She outlined a 3-phase strategy: formal letters asserting my rights, mediation if necessary, legal action as last resort. "What about the forgeries?" I asked, thinking of the land documents. "That's clearer cut. We have incontrovertible evidence of forgery, which is criminal. We'll give Andrew one opportunity to rectify before involving law enforcement." "He won't back down easily," I warned, stomach tightening. "He's never faced this level of documented evidence before. And he's always trusted you would prioritize harmony over justice." The observation struck me as profoundly accurate. Both Andrew and Harlow had built strategies on the assumption I would accept partial credit rather than demand what was rightfully mine. The realization sent heat across my skin, not shame, but righteous indignation. At the historical center that afternoon, I entered Harlow's office for our scheduled meeting, carrying only a small notepad, a deliberate choice after decades of over-preparing to compensate for anticipated dismissal. I wanted to touch base about the Community Preservation Initiative, he began. Zoe has questions about implementation. I was hoping you might provide some transitional guidance. The request was framed as flattering, acknowledging my expertise while facilitating its appropriation. The old Linda would have agreed immediately, grateful for even minimal recognition. I'd be happy to discuss proper attribution for my methodology, I said instead, voice calm but firm. The words felt like freshly sharpened tools. Harlow's smile flickered. Well, this is a departmental initiative, but your contributions would be acknowledged in the implementation phase. My contributions constitute the entire methodology, James, I corrected. As documented in my notes dating back to 2016, 3 years before you joined. His expression shifted from benevolent manager to cautious strategist. Methodologies developed while employed here belong to the center, not individual staff members. If developed as part of assigned duties with institutional resources, I agreed. However, I developed these techniques independently, often using personal time, and later implemented them with proper approval. Harlow's brow furrowed. Documentation? Extensive documentation, I confirmed. A drop of sweat appeared at his temple, including dated development notes, implementation records, and community testimonials. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash across his face, the realization he had miscalculated. By meeting's end, we'd reached a compromise. Shared attribution, restored role as project co-lead, and mutual review of public-facing materials. Not complete victory, but a significant recalibration of power. That evening, I discovered an online discussion among archivists about work being attributed to department heads rather than original developers. The comments revealed dozens of similar experiences, predominantly from women. What I'd thought was an isolated experience was a systemic pattern, one many were ready to help disrupt. Document everything, advised Catherine Wilson, an archivist who had successfully challenged similar appropriation. The same skills that make us good archivists make us formidable advocates. The final piece fell into place when Diane called. The State Historical Society director wants to meet about your integrated approach across domains. They mentioned potential joint publication opportunities. A fluttering sensation began in my chest. Hope, I realized, an emotion almost forgotten. As I hung up, my phone showed a notification for tomorrow's custody mediation with Andrew. The parallel tracks of my reclamation were converging, requiring me to stand firm in my integrated value. I opened my grandmother's desk and removed a small velvet box containing a vintage key brooch, the one she'd worn to every commission meeting where her unacknowledged systems were discussed. A private symbol of the knowledge others depended upon while dismissing its source. I pinned it to my jacket, feeling its weight against my chest. The metal warmed quickly against my skin. Tomorrow, I told her photograph, we unlock a different future. The mediation room at the county courthouse was deliberately neutral. Beige walls, functional furniture, a round table meant to eliminate power positions. I arrived 15 minutes early. Jessica Torres beside me, my grandmother's key brooch catching the fluorescent light from its position on my charcoal blazer. Its weight pressed against my collarbone, a tangible reminder of generations who had faced erasure without recourse. Remember, Jessica murmured as we arranged our materials, he's expecting you to yield at the first sign of conflict. Your consistent boundaries will be more destabilizing than any argument. I nodded, my heart hammering but my hands steady. My documentation was organized in a leather portfolio, every intervention strategy, educational assessment, and support system I'd developed for Kevin meticulously cataloged. Andrew entered precisely on time. His attorney in tow, his familiar confidence faltered slightly when he registered my appearance, not just the structured blazer instead of my usual cardigan, but the way I sat square-shouldered rather than slightly hunched, my direct gaze rather than the habitual downward glance. "Linda," he nodded, his tone carrying that blend of condescension and familiarity he'd perfected over decades. "You're looking different." "Thank you," I replied evenly. The muscles in my face remained neutral, betraying none of the satisfaction I felt at his subtle disorientation. The mediator outlined the process before turning to Andrew. "Mr. Matthews, you've requested a modification to the support agreement for your son, Kevin. Please explain your rationale." Andrew leaned forward with practiced authority. "It's quite straightforward. The current arrangement was established when Linda's professional responsibilities were more demanding. Her position has since been restructured to a less intensive role, which means she has additional capacity for direct caregiving. I'm simply requesting an adjustment that reflects this change." The ease with which he presented this mischaracterization, as if my professional demotion were a lifestyle choice rather than an act of erasure, sent a flutter of anxiety through my chest. For decades, this had been our pattern: Andrew defining reality, me struggling to assert alternative perspectives within frameworks he controlled. "Not today." "Ms. Matthews, your response?" the mediator prompted. I opened my portfolio with steady hands. "I'd like to address two fundamental misrepresentations. First, my position was restructured without consultation as part of an inappropriate appropriation of my intellectual property. Second, Mr. Matthews has fundamentally mischaracterized the nature of my caregiving responsibilities." Andrew's jaw tightened, that barely perceptible clenching that preceded outbursts that never quite materialized in public. I continued before he could interject. I placed the school district contract on the table. The paper made a crisp sound against the wooden surface. "This is a consulting agreement with Westbrook County Schools to implement the specialized documentation system I developed for Kevin. They've engaged me professionally because these techniques represent significant innovation in educational support for neurodivergent students." Andrew's expression flickered with surprise as the mediator reviewed the contract. "The specialized supports I provide require professional expertise developed over 22 years, I continued, my voice finding a rhythm of quiet authority I hadn't known I possessed. Expertise that has been repeatedly dismissed as just being a mom, but is now being formally recognized by educational institutions. Expertise that comes with a $12,000 consulting fee and potential ongoing professional engagement." Andrew's neck flushed slightly above his collar. "Linda has always been an involved mother," he conceded, shifting tactics. "But the support calculation should reflect her available time, not the quality of her involvement. Her job is now explicitly less demanding." "My job," I interrupted, the directness stopping him mid-sentence, "is being an archivist with specialized expertise. That hasn't changed, regardless of institutional restructuring. What has changed is my willingness to allow others to define the value of my contributions." The words hung between us. Andrew blinked rapidly, momentarily speechless at being contradicted so directly. I placed another document on the table, an offer letter from the State Historical Society expressing interest in my integrated methodological approach. "My career is expanding, not contracting," I stated, each word distinct and carefully weighted, "and the specialized support I provide for Kevin has professional value that should be properly recognized in any recalculation of shared responsibilities." The mediator studied both documents before addressing Andrew. "Mr. Matthews, these materials significantly impact your characterization of Miss Matthews' professional circumstances. Would you like time to reconsider your petition?" Andrew persisted. "This doesn't change the fundamental reality that Linda's position at the Historical Center has been reduced. Due to intellectual property appropriation that is currently being addressed through separate legal channels." Jessica interjected smoothly. "We have documentation of that situation as well, if relevant." For perhaps the first time in our decades of interaction, I watched Andrew calculate from a position of informational disadvantage. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead as he glanced at his attorney. He had always controlled the professional narrative, leveraging his legal expertise to define the terms of our interactions. Now, faced with comprehensive documentation he hadn't anticipated, that advantage was evaporating. During a 15-minute recess, I heard the muffled rise and fall of their voices in the hallway. Andrew's occasionally sharp with frustration, his attorney's lower and more measured. When they returned, Andrew's approach had shifted. In light of the additional information, I'm willing to withdraw the petition for modification and maintain the current arrangement. That's not sufficient, I replied, surprising even myself with my directness. The words felt like cool, clean water in my mouth after years of swallowing sand. Andrew's eyebrows rose. Not sufficient? I'm offering to withdraw completely. Your petition was based on a deliberate mischaracterization of my professional standing, one that connects directly to patterns of erasure in multiple domains of my life. I placed a third document on the table, copies of the land sale agreements bearing my forged signature. This pattern extends beyond custody matters, I continued steadily. These documents show my signature forged on land sales I never authorized, land that was explicitly excluded from marital assets in our divorce settlement. The color drained from Andrew's face. Those land parcels were essentially abandoned, he said, his voice hardening. You've done nothing with that property for years. It was sitting there worthless while I found a productive use for it. It wasn't yours to use, productively or otherwise, I pointed out. Just as my time isn't yours to reallocate based on your assessment of its value. I felt a curious stillness settle over me, not the frozen immobility of fear, but the centered calm of truth finally spoken aloud. This is exactly why our marriage failed, Andrew snapped, his composure cracking. You were always so rigidly literal about boundaries, so unwilling to be flexible when it came to my career needs. Our marriage failed, I said quietly, meeting his gaze directly, because you consistently prioritized your needs while expecting me to remain indefinitely flexible, because you valued what I contributed only when it served your purposes, because you taught our children that my work, my expertise, and my property were less significant than yours. The room fell silent. Andrew switched to the persuasive tone that had once been effective, leaning forward to create artificial intimacy. Linda, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. We both want what's best for Kevin. Let's set aside these other issues and focus on his needs. I'm willing to withdraw the petition entirely as a gesture of good faith. In the past, this strategic reasonableness would have worked. I would have accepted the minimal concession, grateful to avoid conflict. Your withdrawal of the petition is appropriate, I acknowledged, but insufficient given the deliberate misrepresentations involved. I'm requesting 3 specific remedies. First, a formal acknowledgement that my professional status has not been diminished, but enhanced through external recognition. Second, an adjustment to the support calculation that properly values the specialized expertise I provide. And third, immediate cessation of all development activities on my property pending resolution of the forgery matter. Andrew's reasonable facade crumbled entirely. This is absurd. You can't possibly Actually, his attorney interrupted firmly, fingers digging visibly into Andrew's forearm. We should discuss these terms privately, Andrew. When they returned to the discussion, the shift was unmistakable. His attorney took the lead, Andrew uncharacteristically silent beside him, jaw tight and eyes fixed on the middle distance. My client is prepared to withdraw the petition unconditionally and acknowledge Miss Matthews' professional standing. Regarding the property matter, he will instruct Evergreen Development to halt activities pending resolution of ownership questions. As for support recalculation, we propose maintaining current financial arrangements while establishing more explicit recognition of Miss Matthews' specialized support contributions. As the mediator formalized these terms, I maintained my composure. When we concluded, Andrew attempted one final assertion of familiar dynamics. "I hope you're satisfied, Linda," he said, a hint of bitterness edging his voice. "This level of confrontation isn't like you." I met his gaze directly. "That assessment may have been accurate in the past, but your understanding of who I am has been incomplete for a very long time." The second confrontation unfolded 3 days later at the Historical Center's main exhibition hall, where the newly launched Community Heritage Preservation Initiative was being presented to major donors. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a deep blue dress that stood out against the institutional neutrals typically worn by staff. Director Harlow was mid-presentation, Zoe beside him, managing the slides, when he spotted me entering. A momentary hesitation in his practiced delivery revealed his uncertainty about my presence at an event I hadn't been formally invited to attend. "As you can see," he continued, gesturing to the methodology flowchart projected behind him, my flowchart, with my distinctive organizational approach. "This innovative methodology creates a unique integration of traditional archival practices with community-based documentation approaches." I made my way quietly to where Eleanor Washington sat with several other community elders whose histories had been preserved through my techniques. Eleanor nodded, almost imperceptibly, the signal we had agreed upon. "The centerpiece of this approach," Harlow explained, advancing to a slide showing the family history authentication protocol I had developed, "is a specialized validation system that establishes provenance for oral histories, connecting them with physical artifacts through documented contextual analysis." "Excuse me," Eleanor's voice carried clearly across the room. "I have a question about the development of this specific protocol." The room hushed immediately. Eleanor Washington was not someone easily dismissed in our community. Harlow's smile remained fixed, though a flicker of wariness crossed his face. "Of course, Mrs. Washington. I'd be happy to elaborate on the departmental approach." "That's precisely my question," Eleanor continued, rising to stand beside me. Her perfume, lavender with a hint of vanilla, drifted between us, comforting and formidable at once. "This protocol was developed in my living room in 2017 by Linda Matthews as she worked to preserve my family's historical documents after the flood. I watched her create this approach over several weeks, taking notes in a journal I still have in my possession. Yet, I don't see her credited in your presentation." The room fell silent, donors and board members shifting uncomfortably. "Mrs. Washington," Harlow began, his tone professionally conciliatory, "you're absolutely right that Linda made valuable contributions to this methodology. As I mentioned earlier, this was a collaborative departmental development." "I have a similar question," interrupted Mr. Henderson, another community elder rising to his feet. "Ms. Matthews developed these exact techniques while preserving our family's historical photographs in 2018. I have dated documentation of her process, including specific innovations you're describing as recent departmental developments." One by one, community members stood 7 in total, each with specific testimonials about when and how I had developed the methodology, being presented as institutional innovation, each with documentation to support their claims. "I was there when Ms. Matthews created the cross-referencing system for oral histories," said Maria Gonzalez, her voice strong despite her 83 years. "She sat at my kitchen table for 3 days, working out the verification protocols you're now claiming as institutional developments." Throughout these testimonials, I remained standing, silent but visible, no longer relegated to the basement archives, no longer minimized in institutional narratives. The weight of collective witness surrounded me like a protective shield. Harlow's practiced composure visibly crumbled as the weight of community testimony accumulated. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline. Board members exchanged concerned glances. Donors leaned forward with increased interest, the unmistakable scent of institutional scandal piquing their attention. When the last community member had spoken, Harlow attempted to regain control. I appreciate these perspectives. And of course, Linda's contributions to our archival methodologies have been significant. They haven't been contributions, James, I stated, finally breaking my silence. The sound of my voice, clear, steady, carrying to the back of the room without strain, seemed to surprise even me. They've been innovations, methodologies I developed independently and implemented at the Historical Center over the past 7 years. Methodologies now being presented without proper attribution. I moved forward, each step deliberate, until I stood at the front of the room beside him. The click of my heels against the polished floor punctuated my approach. The Community Heritage Preservation Initiative is built entirely on techniques I developed, documented, and implemented, techniques now being presented as departmental innovations, despite clear evidence of their origin. Harlow's expression hardened. Linda, this is hardly the appropriate venue for personnel discussions. We can address your concerns privately. This isn't a personnel matter, I corrected, my voice calm but carrying clearly. It's an attribution matter, a question of intellectual property and proper credit. The same principles we apply to the historical records we preserve. You're making a scene, Harlow hissed. No, I replied with quiet certainty. I'm correcting the historical record, and as an archivist, that's precisely my responsibility. I turned to address the room directly, conscious of the board members and donors watching with rapt attention. For 7 years, I've developed and implemented a community-based preservation methodology that has successfully preserved dozens of family histories throughout Westbrook County. This methodology has been recognized by the State Historical Society as an innovative approach, bridging institutional and community archives. As I spoke, I moved to the computer controlling the presentation and opened a file from my USB drive, a comprehensive documentation of the methodology's development, complete with dated entries, implementation notes, and external validation. This is the actual development timeline, I explained, advancing through slides showing the evolution of the methodology from concept to implementation. As you can see, each component was developed, documented, and implemented years before being incorporated into the current initiative. Charles Bannerman, the board chair, raised his hand. I think we need to understand this situation more thoroughly. If there are attribution concerns with a major initiative, the board should be fully informed. For 20 minutes, I presented the documented timeline, accompanied by testimonials from community members. I maintained professional composure throughout, neither accusatory nor apologetic, simply presenting factual evidence with archival precision. When I finished, the room remained silent. Finally, Mr. Bannerman addressed Harlow directly. James, why wasn't the board informed about these attribution questions before we approved the initiative launch? Harlow's confidence visibly diminished. The methodology was implemented within the Historical Center, which makes it institutional intellectual property, he attempted, though his usual certainty had evaporated. That's not accurate, interjected Catherine Wilson, who had arrived during my presentation. As a member of the State Archives Ethics Committee, her presence added institutional weight to my claims. Methodological innovations developed by staff members retain individual attribution rights, even when implemented institutionally, unless specifically developed under work-for-hire arrangements, designating institutional ownership. Harlow's last defense crumbled under this authoritative correction. The narrative he had constructed, that my innovations were institutional property because they had been implemented in institutional contexts, was revealed as fundamentally misrepresenting professional standards. I believe, said Mr. Bannerman, that we need to reconvene the initiatives committee immediately to address these attribution concerns. In the meantime, all public-facing materials should be revised to properly credit the methodology's developer. The third confrontation took place at Evergreen Development's offices, where Tom Whitaker had requested a meeting to resolve the property documentation inconsistencies. I arrived with Jessica Torres and complete documentation, original deeds, divorce settlement specifications, property surveys, and most damningly, the forensic analysis of the forged signatures. Tom was accompanied by Evergreen's chief legal counsel, Patricia Danvers, and to my surprise, Andrew and his attorney. "Thank you for coming, Miss Matthews," Tom began. "We've asked Mr. Matthews to join us, given the complexity of the situation." "The situation isn't actually complex," Jessica countered. "The property in question belongs solely to Ms. Matthews, was explicitly excluded from marital assets in the divorce settlement, and has been sold without her knowledge or consent using forged signatures." Patricia Danvers reviewed the documents before addressing Andrew directly. "Mr. Matthews, the forensic analysis is quite definitive regarding the signatures. Were you aware that land transfers using forged signatures constitute criminal fraud?" The directness of her question visibly unsettled Andrew. His carefully manicured fingernails tapped once against the glass tabletop before he stilled them. "There may have been some procedural irregularities," he conceded reluctantly, "but the development plan itself is sound. The property has been sitting unused for years." "Unused according to whose definition?" I asked, opening a folder containing my botanical documentation of the property, detailed surveys of native species, water flow patterns, and ecological relationships I had been mapping for decades. "The property has been under continuous ecological observation and documentation since I inherited it. These wetlands contain 7 plant species on the state's protected list, 3 of which have significant research value." Andrew's expression shifted from defensive to genuinely surprised. Like Harlow, he had built his actions on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I valued, assuming that because I hadn't developed the property according to conventional financial metrics, I had no substantive use for it. "Evergreen development cannot proceed with projects involving protected species," Patricia stated firmly, "nor can we move forward with property transfers involving documented forgery." For perhaps the first time in his professional life, Andrew found himself without effective leverage, caught between the corporate legal standards he had violated and the ecological regulations he had dismissed. "What do you want, Linda?" he asked finally, dropping the legal framing to address me directly. I met his gaze steadily. "I want 3 things. First, immediate cessation of all development activities on my property. Second, formal acknowledgement that the sales were conducted fraudulently. And third, restoration of any ecological damage already caused by preliminary development work." "That's going to be extremely costly," Andrew protested. But the fight had gone out of his voice. "Yes," I agreed simply. "Fraud typically is." In that moment, I saw something I had never witnessed in 27 years of marriage. Andrew recognizing that he could not charm, manipulate, or intimidate his way out of accountability. The meeting concluded with a formal agreement. All development would cease immediately. Ecological assessment would determine restoration requirements. And most significantly, Andrew would provide a notarized statement acknowledging the forgeries rather than facing criminal charges. As we gathered our materials to leave, Andrew made one final attempt to reestablish familiar patterns. "I hope you realize what you're throwing away," he said, lowering his voice. "That development would have been worth millions. Our children's inheritance." "Our children's inheritance," I interrupted quietly, meeting his gaze directly, "includes more than money. It includes integrity, accountability, and respect for boundaries. Values they haven't consistently seen modeled in our family." He flinched as if I'd struck him, the words landing with more force than any physical blow could have. For perhaps the first time, he saw me clearly, not as the accommodating ex-wife whose boundaries could be ignored, but as a woman of substance whose values had weight and consequence. The most profound confrontation occurred in the most personal context. A family dinner I hosted at my home. As we shared a meal around my modest dining table, Kevin asked the question, that had clearly been on his mind throughout these events. "Mom, why now?" he asked, his directness a reflection of his neurodivergent perspective. "You've always been so accommodating, with Dad, with work, with everything." The directness of his question hit me with unexpected force. The dinner around us seemed to pause, the clinking of silverware momentarily suspended as all eyes turned to me. "I realized," I said carefully, "that I was teaching the wrong lesson by accepting persistent patterns of erasure. That by allowing my contributions to be minimized, I was suggesting that's what people like me should expect." "People like you?" Kevin asked, genuinely curious. "Women, caregivers, support professionals, people whose expertise crosses domains rather than remaining safely specialized." I reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. People whose worth isn't always recognized by conventional metrics. My son's expression shifted as he processed this explanation. "Like me," he said softly. Recognition dawning. People whose contributions aren't always visible in standard ways. "Exactly like you," I confirmed, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion tighten my throat, which is why it finally became clear that accepting erasure wasn't just harmful to me, it was harmful to everyone whose value deserves proper recognition regardless of how it's expressed. In that moment of connection with my son, his neurodivergent perspective illuminating the broader implications of my individual reclamation, I felt the full circle of justice completed. Not just institutional correction or legal accountability, but the deeper justice of breaking intergenerational patterns of erasure before they could shape another generation's understanding of whose contributions deserve recognition. The patterns that had defined my life for decades, patterns my grandmother had documented in her own journals, patterns reinforced across professional and personal domains, would not extend into my son's future. The archive of erasure ended with me. Segment 6. Transformation and New Life. 18 months later, morning light streamed through the wall of windows in my new office at the State Historical Society, casting golden patterns across my grandmother's antique roll-top desk, now prominently positioned where visitors could admire its history rather than tucked away in a corner. The brass nameplate on my door read, "Linda Matthews, Director of Integrated Archival Methodology," a title created specifically for my unique cross-domain expertise. I ran my fingers along the smooth wooden surface, feeling the subtle indentations from 3 generations of women's work. The wood felt warm beneath my touch, as if it held living memories rather than just marks of use. I'd discovered several hidden compartments containing my grandmother's notes on county systems she'd developed, but never received credit for. I'd had these framed alongside my own methodology documentation, a visual genealogy of innovation finally receiving proper recognition. My reflection caught my attention, the physical transformation still occasionally surprising me. My hair now styled with subtle highlights that accentuated rather than concealed the silver strands. My posture upright and confident rather than diminished. My clothing rich jewel tones and structured silhouettes that commanded respectful attention rather than fading into institutional beige. The intercom chimed. "Dr. Matthews, your 10 o'clock appointment has arrived." Dr. Matthews. The title still sent a pleasant shiver of recognition through me. Earned through the completion of my doctoral dissertation at 56, funded partially by the settlement from the Historical Center's intellectual property case. "Send them in, please," I responded, adjusting the arrangement of materials on my desk, copies of my recently published book, Preserving Across Domains, alongside the curriculum for the new certification program I'd developed. The door opened to reveal a nervous-looking woman in her early 40s, clutching a portfolio case. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her gaze darting around the room before settling briefly on me, then away again. Body language I recognized all too well. "Dr. Matthews," I'm Susan Hendricks from the Camden Historical Society. Thank you for seeing me." Her voice carried the familiar undertone of someone trying to apologize for taking up space. "Please, call me Linda," I said. "Your email about attribution concerns caught my attention immediately." "I wasn't sure who to contact," she began, words accelerating with nervous energy. "But your book, it described exactly what I'm experiencing. My methodology for community oral history integration is being implemented countywide, but my director has removed my name from all the documentation. He says it's institutional development, even though I created it on weekends over 3 years. The familiar pattern emerged with each detail she shared. I could have scripted the dismissals: departmental innovation, institutional methodology, collaborative development, the same phrases used to erase my contributions. For the next hour, I reviewed her materials, offering strategic recommendations based on my own experience and the dozens of similar cases I'd consulted on since establishing the Attribution Rights Initiative. The initiative had grown from an informal network into a structured program with legal resources, documentation templates, and institutional accountability frameworks. "You've maintained excellent documentation," I observed as our meeting concluded. "That's going to be crucial in addressing this situation effectively." "I started keeping detailed records after reading about your case," Susan admitted, her posture now more open. "Your story, it made me realize I wasn't imagining the pattern." The validation in her eyes reflected my own experience when I discovered the online community of archivists facing similar challenges. That moment of recognition that what I'd experienced wasn't isolated, but part of a systemic pattern that could be disrupted through collective action. After Susan left, Sarah appeared with 2 coffee cups and a mischievous smile. Her own transformation was evident in her confident stride, a far cry from the woman who had once spoken of her academic dreams as distant possibilities. "Thought you might need caffeine before your National Archives call," she said. "And I wanted to confirm dinner tomorrow. James is making his famous paella." James Barrett, Dr. Barrett, professionally, just James, in the increasingly frequent social gatherings we'd shared. Our relationship had evolved from professional collaboration to friendship to something more personal, characterized by mutual respect and recognition of each other's expertise. "I'm looking forward to it," I confirmed. "How's the dissertation coming along?" Sarah's smile broadened. "Final revisions submitted yesterday. Defense scheduled for next month. I still can't quite believe I'm finishing a PhD at 51. "I can," I said simply. "You've always had this capacity. You just needed institutional structures that recognized rather than constrained it." Sarah's return to graduate school had been partly inspired by my own reclamation journey, one of several ripple effects that extended beyond my individual situation. "By the way," Sarah added, "I saw Andrew yesterday at the Community Foundation meeting. I felt a momentary flutter of the old anxiety at his name, but it faded quickly." "How did that go?" "Awkwardly, for him," Sarah reported with satisfaction. "He's still adjusting to not being the most influential person in the room, especially now that you're on the board too." The Community Foundation board position represented another domain of reclamation, civic engagement I'd previously avoided due to Andrew's dominance in local leadership circles. "And Harlow?" I asked. "Still at Rockland County Historical Society, I hear. In a much reduced capacity after the ethics investigation findings." Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Their loss was definitely the state's gain. My transition from the Westbrook County Historical Center to the State Historical Society had followed the resolution of the intellectual property case, a resolution that included formal attribution requirements, financial compensation, and implementation of new institutional guidelines for methodological credit. "Don't forget Kevin's presentation this afternoon," Sarah reminded me. 3 o'clock at the Education Center. Kevin's presentation. My chest warmed with anticipation and pride. My son, now 26, had developed his own integration of specialized interests and professional application, a digital system for making historical archives accessible to neurodivergent researchers. At 2:30, I headed to the Education Center. The presentation room was already filling when I arrived. Educators, archivists, digital accessibility specialists, and family support advocates, creating an impressive interdisciplinary audience. I chose a seat in the middle, visible without dominating, supportive without hovering. Kevin spotted me, acknowledging me with the subtle nod that had been our signal since his childhood. I returned the gesture, respecting the professional boundary he'd established while conveying my presence. Andrew arrived just before the presentation began, taking a seat near the back. Our eyes met briefly across the room, a moment of mutual recognition without the charge of former conflicts. Our relationship had gradually recalibrated to one of reserved civility centered primarily around Kevin. The property dispute had been resolved through ecological designation, the wetlands now preserved as a research site through partnership with the State Environmental Protection Division and Novara Pharmaceuticals, which had identified significant research potential in several plant species I'd documented. What Andrew had dismissed as worthless now generated research grants that would eventually exceed the development value he'd pursued. Kevin's presentation was masterful, clear, engaging, and technically sophisticated. He stood tall at the podium, his voice carrying confidently without the hesitation that had once marked his public speaking. The key insight, he explained, came from my mother's integrated documentation system. She demonstrated how the same core information could be structured differently for different applications, while maintaining integrity across domains. The public acknowledgement, professional rather than merely personal, caught me by surprise. A warm flush spread up my neck and into my cheeks. This integration of our professional domains represented a profound evolution in our relationship, one where we could each maintain distinct expertise while recognizing productive interconnections. After the presentation, I felt a presence beside me and turned to find Andrew. "He's impressive," Andrew said simply. "You did an exceptional job with him." The acknowledgement, straightforward rather than qualified, directed at my contribution rather than contextualizing it as just being a mom, represented subtle but significant evolution. "He did most of the work himself," I replied, neither minimizing my role nor claiming disproportionate credit. "But thank you. Your financial support made much of his educational journey possible." This balanced acknowledgement of our respective contributions, my daily support and advocacy, his financial provision, reflected the more nuanced understanding I'd worked to establish in the aftermath of our legal confrontations. "The wetlands research site," Andrew said after a moment. "The preliminary findings are quite remarkable. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be significant." I nodded, recognizing this as his way of acknowledging the value I'd seen when he had not. The ecological survey identified 17 plant species of research interest, 3 with potential pharmaceutical applications. Worth considerably more than the development potential, he admitted, the closest he would likely come to acknowledging his fundamental miscalculation. "Different kinds of value," I corrected gently. "Not just financial metrics." That evening, I returned to my home, a historic craftsman bungalow I'd purchased with part of my settlement and grant income. The renovated space reflected my integrated aesthetic, archival quality storage systems for professional materials, alongside comfortable living areas, historical elements preserved with meticulous care, alongside modern additions. My home office walls displayed framed copies of my book cover, journal publications, and most prominently, my doctoral diploma alongside a photograph of 3 generations of women in my family: my grandmother, my mother, and me. A visual genealogy of preservation expertise, finally receiving proper recognition. I opened my laptop to the online forum for archivists navigating attribution challenges, the community that had expanded from dozens to hundreds of members. My role had evolved from seeking support to providing it, from documenting patterns to disrupting them, from individual reclamation to systemic change. A notification appeared, a reminder for tomorrow's meeting with the Legislative Committee, considering new standards for intellectual property attribution in publicly funded institutions. The policy implications of my individual case had expanded far beyond my personal situation, creating opportunity for structural changes that might prevent similar patterns of erasure for others. As evening settled, I moved to the sunroom, overlooking the garden I'd planted with native species propagated from my wetlands property. The plants thrived in their transplanted environment, adapting successfully to new conditions while maintaining their essential nature. Like me, I had not discarded my preservationist nature, my meticulous documentation habits, my attention to detail, or my capacity for supportive engagement. Those essential qualities remained intact. What had changed was their application, no longer confined to supporting others' recognition while accepting my own erasure, but integrated into a balanced approach that valued all domains of contribution. My phone chimed with a text from James, Paella ingredients acquired. Looking forward to tomorrow evening. The journal editor called. They're publishing your article in the next issue. Such a simple message, yet it captured the integration I had achieved. Professional recognition alongside personal connection, individual accomplishment, alongside shared experience, not compartmentalized domains hierarchically valued, but interconnected aspects of a balanced life. The native plants cast long shadows across the lawn, distinct individual forms that sometimes merged, sometimes remained separate, but coexisted in a harmonious ecosystem. I had spent 24 years preserving other people's stories, while my own was systematically erased. Now I preserved my own story alongside others, neither diminished nor exaggerated, neither hidden nor dominant, but accurately integrated into the complete historical record I had helped create. Every archivist understands that preservation isn't primarily about the past. It's about ensuring the past remains accessible to inform the future. The records I had maintained, the documentation I had preserved, the evidence I had assembled, these weren't just validation of what had been, but foundation for what could be. For Susan Hendricks, navigating attribution challenges. For Kevin, developing accessible archives. For Sarah, completing her dissertation at 51. For generations of contributors whose innovations deserved recognition regardless of domain, regardless of gender, regardless of institutional position. The true power of archives isn't in their preservation, but in their accessibility, in their capacity to be retrieved when needed, referenced when relevant, integrated into evolving understanding, rather than permanently archived away. That was the transformation I had achieved. Not just personally, but systemically, not just reclaiming my individual contributions, but creating pathways for others to maintain proper attribution of theirs. Not just correcting historical erasures, but preventing future ones through structural changes in how contributions were documented, credited, and valued. As darkness settled over my garden, I thought about the generations of women in my family who had developed innovations without recognition, innovations preserved in private journals, but erased from public records. The pattern that had persisted until I disrupted it through comprehensive documentation, strategic advocacy, and institutional recalibration. That legacy, more than any specific methodology, represented the true transformation. Not just a new life for me individually, but a new framework for recognizing, documenting, and valuing contributions across domains and across generations. Not archived away, but properly preserved. Not filed for later reference, but actively informing present understanding. Not erased from history, but accurately integrated into the ongoing record of who contributed, what they created, and how it mattered across all domains of human experience.